I'm here today with Sheila Beckford and Michelle Letter, authors of a new book coming out this month from Chalice Press called Anti-Racism for Reals, Real Talk with Real Strategies in Real Time for Real Change. Reverend Sheila Beckford is an active anti-racism trainer with national and global audiences. She serves the United Methodist Congregation in the New York Annual Conference. Reverend Michelle Letter is also an active anti-racism trainer with national and global audiences and serves on the ministerial staff at Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, many congratulations on the book. I'm anxious to read it. But before we get into that, maybe each of you could tell us a little bit more about your background and your other work besides the book. Sheila, you want to go first?
Sure. I am, as you mentioned, an elder within the New York Annual Conference in United Methodist Church. I pastor John Wesley United Methodist Church in Brooklyn. I have been active in anti-racism work since I was very young, just being exposed to I guess I'll call it internalized racism within our community, and the differences and people recognizing the differences because of our nationality. And so that work began in me very young. So I was able to identify it because, of course, I've been experiencing being that my family was not originally from here, from the U.S. And so it was just something I have to say came from my ancestors, that passion to unite us as a people. I am very active as far as dancing and also teaching young people about racism and anti-racism. And I started an after school program at one of the churches I was at to actually teach them so they can actually identify it and not become it, not to become racist or internalize racism, but identify it and resist it. So that's basically where I am, and as much as I'm sharing at this moment.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
So Michelle, how about you?
Well, my formal work or more formal work in anti-racism started in seminary. I graduated from the Candler School of Theology in 2010, and I served in some leadership roles there. And part of those leadership roles also included chairing some committees on coming together across lines of different kinds, creating fishbowl kind of conversations for the community to come together and model, what different kinds of faithful dialogues would look like from with folks from different perspectives. Part of that started my work to focus on racism specifically and anti-racism. And then throughout my PhD work, it just gathered steam, let's say. So even though I'd been thinking about, what it meant to fight injustice kind of generally, certainly my whiteness allowed for me to stand back and not do specific work that had to do with racism. I have never been the direct target of racism and experienced for quite some time the cushion that I have not only been allowed but taken advantage of to not actively pursue anti-racism work. For the last 6 years, I guess now, I've worked for the General Commission on Religion and Race, which is the general agency or the global agency within the United Methodist Church set apart to dismantle racism at all levels within the denomination. So there I serve as the director of anti-racism education, and I create and facilitate workshops and create resources for lay people and bishops and all sorts of folks to engage in anti-racism work in different ways. I'm currently doing my PhD work at Emory University, and my work focuses on anti-racism preaching. So what does it mean for those of us who are white to preach anti-racist sermons about anti-racism without perpetrating more racism. And then, as you mentioned, I serve at Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in DC, and I'm an ordained elder in the AME Church out of the 2nd Episcopal District.
Wow, you both accomplished a lot and have a lot going on, which is really wonderful to hear. I'm very impressed and glad to learn about it. So let's get into the book. From what I understand, the way that this came about was the first time that the two of you met each other. So how did that happen, and how did that turn into a book?
So Reverend Letta and I met because there was a conference that I attended, and it was supposed to be it was a conference about an oppressed group, right? And we were there in support of the oppressed group. And while we were there, the social action Christian group perpetrated racism to a group of us who were Black by telling us we were not welcomed in a space that we were actually invited to. And as I said, this is a social action group that's supposed to stand up against oppression, right?
Wow.
And so Reverend Letta was asked to mediate a meeting between me and another person who was targeted. So we met, and it was like we didn't have a script prepared. She had her tools together. I had just had a testimony I was going to share as to what actually took place. And it was as if this was just ordained. This meeting was ordained. Our meeting was ordained. And she stepped in as the mediator, and I was actually impressed by her because she did not allow the white woman who was there, who actually was the perpetrator, she did not allow her to cry herself out of the situation. She didn't allow her to use white manipulation to steer the conversation or to move the conversation from what we were there, what the purpose of our meeting. And so I was just impressed by that. And then afterwards, we became friends. From that one meeting, we became friends. And I'm going to ask Reverend Letta to share her perspective. But when we became friends, it was like, we should write a book. We did a workshop together, and the workshop, we didn't practice the workshop either. She came in, I came in with my stuff. She came in with her stuff. We knocked it out apart. And we said afterwards, we should write a book. And then we actually wrote the book.
You all just click.
Yes, immediately. So again,
so cool.
I think, yes, it was just meant to be. So Reverend Letta, please share your perspective.
Sure. I mean, my perspective mirrors Reverend Beckford, certainly. Oh, this is my dog who's decided to be part of every meeting.
Oh, that's fine.
I apologize.
We invite all animals. No problem.
So I'm introducing Cashmere. So, so yeah, we had not met before. We both had, different emphases of why we were there. And the rhythm and flow really of the way that we engaged that particular group just felt like even though we were coming from different perspectives, even though we had different experiences and even specifically different anti-racism work that we had done before, somehow the ways that we went about doing anti-racism were similar. One of the things I'll just say that impressed me so much about working with Reverend Beckford is her integrity is unimpeachable. She's absolutely never afraid to speak the truth, where, when, and how it needs to be spoken. And honestly, I think that when doing anti-racism work, that level of integrity and truth-telling and courage is contagious. There may be people that resist it. There may be people that get really mad at it, but it's contagious in the way that if there is any glimpse of the work to be done, if there's any glimpse of mustard seed, let's say, right, of anti-racism work that's ready to happen in those moments, that's the kind of integrity and courage that brings it forward. And Reverend Beckford embodies that. And like she said, afterwards, we had these conversations. She is in charge of, well, it's called BMCR, Black Methodist for Church Renewal. Okay, yeah. Oh, I got it. So she's the chair of that for the whole New York annual conference, and her annual conference really wanted anti-racism training. I was creating a curriculum, piloting a curriculum for G-Corps, and we started talking and said, well, why don't we do these together? Why don't we run it through the New York annual conference? And like she said, every time we got together, there was this rhythm and flow. And what we realized is that part of the reason that that was happening is because we were working out of racial positionality, right? She wasn't trying to pretend that she was somebody else. She was coming from her own identity and understanding and perspectives and experiences as a Black Latina woman. And I was coming from my own experiences as a white woman. And because we were talking about similar things, but from our authentic perspectives, we realized that people were able to connect with it even across lines of racial difference. And so when we started talking about the book, we said, hey, why don't we write a book that actually comes from our own racialized perspective, a positionality, and then we'll create learning engagements together. And that became the structure of the actual book.
Wow. I mean, it really speaks to the value of that model, quite frankly, of having, two different, perspectives from different backgrounds for an issue like this, right? That is obviously challenging for a lot of people to deal with. I have to say, most of the people that I interview for anti-racism books, it's usually one person writing the book, as opposed to this kind of partnership that you all have, described and implemented. So that's just really interesting to see. So how did it turn into a book? I mean, literally in terms of getting it published, did you all approach Chalice, or did Chalice approach you? Or because I always find it fascinating in terms of how people manage to get books published, because it's always, quite an interesting story.
Mm-hmm. Well, we approached Chalice.
Okay.
So Michelle had previously submitted an inquiry to Chalice Press, and they liked her work. And so she had the information, Brad Lyons information. And so she said, well, let's do this. Let's just submit one. So we did. And so she said it was okay. So Michelle says, okay, Sheila, let's not get excited. They probably won't answer us for about another month or so. And
this is typical within publishing, is that, it takes a long time usually to hear anything back, if you hear anything back.
Yes. And I have to say, well, how long was it, Michelle?
I mean, I think the first response was within a week.
Yes.
And then when they got to the proposal stage, they asked us right away, can you send us a full proposal?
Awesome.
So yeah, it moved incredibly fast.
That's so great to hear.
Absolutely.
Well, that says a lot right there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we were like, oh, and I think it was like a matter of about an hour that Brad got back to us, and he said, well, let me send this over to marketing and see if they'll be interested. And he said that was quick. They said yes. They say yes. So we were like, oh, wonderful, so let's get started. And so it just went very, very quickly. And we were writing within this, I think maybe 2 months time after. Yeah.
From our very first conversation, if I remember correctly, our very first, we should write a book, just kind of offhand comment was last August.
Yes.
Wow.
August 2020. And we were under contract with Chalice Press by November.
Yes.
Within November.
Wow, so
because one of the
over a
first
year.
conversations we had with them was right after the election.
Hmm.
And so it moved very, very quickly. So when Reverend Beckford said earlier, it just seemed like it was ordained. It felt like this timeline was, it was so much quicker than what you traditionally hear with regards to publishing, that we really felt like this was bigger than the both of us.
That's just so great to hear. I'm really glad for all of you because that's not typical, in terms of publishing timelines. So great to see that this worked out so well. So the book is titled, Anti-Racism for Reals. And I mentioned the different reels that are the subtitle. What do those stand for, in terms of anti-racism work?
Yeah. So real talk is the way we approach everything we do, say, and write. Rather than just having more talk and more talk and more talk that rehashes the same kinds of things, or perhaps is so superficial that you might as well be talking about the weather or the local sports team. Even conversations that sometimes are labeled anti-racism or diversity or something like that, never get to actually what needs to happen to interrupt and dismantle racism. So our real talk is not only the way that we talk about it, but it's also getting to what needs to be talked about. And so real talk with real strategies, really, some people have described this book as a workbook, because throughout the whole book, there are areas where the reader can write or take notes or make connections. There's at least 137 strategies listed in the book.
Wow.
That are throughout the whole thing. And then at the end, there's an appendix that has all 137 of them with page references. We're really about getting to do anti-racism work right now. So there's no time like the present. As soon as you click leave meeting, as soon as you close the book, as soon as you read about that strategy, you can enact it. And then in real time, because racism happens in real time, and so anti-racism must also happen in real time. So there are interruptions, there are role plays, there are strategies that people can start to use, again, right away to interrupt racism in real time. And then real change, rather than focusing on intention, rather than focusing on even the reality that people are coming in from different entry points. The focus in real change is what kind of accountability and what kind of procedures and practices and policies need to be in place in order for anti-racism to actually happen. So we talk about it in terms of real, as in actual, what will actually do it? How do we actually talk about it? How we actually do it? How do we actually do it in real time? And then how do we actually make sure anti-racism happens?
Well, I love the practicality of that, right? And kind of avoiding the fluff and getting to the substance of it. So that's just a wonderful approach. So in the book, you use the term BIPAL to describe people of color. What does that mean, and why did you choose to use that?
Well, BIPAL, that's what we use instead of people of color or BIPOC people. What happens when we talk about races, right? The race, we have white. No, we say white people. But when we talk about people of color, we call them people of color, as if we don't have a separate identities. So with BIPAL, it's separating that. It's separating our identities as Black, Indigenous, Pacific Islanders, Asian, Latino, Latinx.
Okay.
Right. So when you say BIPAL now, it's going to be in your mind that we are talking about Black people, Indigenous people, Pacific Islanders, Asian, Latino, Latinx people, not people of color who no longer have a separate identity. We just place them all together and then you center whiteness. So the purpose is to decenter whiteness and make sure that every one of us have an identity as if we were white.
Okay. Well, thanks for explaining. That's the first time I'd heard that term.
I created it.
Oh, did you really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Maybe, I hope it catches on.
Me too. We don't need to be lumped in as if we don't have an identity and as if we're not as important as those who are white.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, 3 years ago, I launched the Publishing in Color conference series, which, is aimed at trying to increase the number of books published by writers of color. And I struggled with what to name it,
mm-hmm.
And so I talked with several different, author friends of mine and publishing industry people of mine, that were from different minority groups. And that was the best we could come up with. But we didn't think about something like what you're describing. So I'll have to think about that further. In any event, there have been several different books, recently published about anti-racism, especially over the, last year and a half or whatever. What do you think makes this one different from the others?
I will have to say that I'm going to use an example. I'll start off. Michelle will jump in. I'm going to use this as an example. After the election, we were having a conversation with a member of the publishing house at Chalice Press. And a question was asked of us, well, what are you all going to do differently with the book now that the election happened, as if racism disappeared because the election happened, And so our response was absolutely nothing, because our methods are the same. Nothing is changing. We are still, the object is actually to teach people how to be anti-racist and to use our method with entry points and logic, and not blaming, taking what we see in many of the books that we do read is that the blame is shifted from the perpetrator to the target. And what I mean by that is we are considered now the perpetrator, right? The oppressor, and those who are supportive of white supremacy and who are enacting this, right, and causing harm, they are now looked at as victims. And in a lot of the books, the targets, because of their behavior or because of how they try to navigate this system of white supremacy, they are at fault for their decisions or the decisions that had to be made because there was no other choice. So we have systems that are steeped in white supremacy. And so people, BIPOC people, have to navigate this. Sometimes they have to assimilate. Let's say they have to assimilate, and they have to behave a certain way in order to keep their jobs. They have to behave a certain way to be promoted. They have to behave a certain way to be accepted. And so then in some of the books, they make it seem as if they have a choice, and their only choice is either do it or be unemployed. So we do not shift the blame on the target or the oppressed. We keep the blame on white supremacy. So that's one way our book is different. Reverend Letter?
Yeah, I think another way that this book maybe stands out is that the way that we talk about racism, the way that we talk about even responsibility for anti-racism, doesn't shy away from certain conversations or certain things that need to be said or certain strategies by using language of, let's say, euphemism, right? So when we look at a particular, let's say, expression of racism, or when we look at a particular strategy, or when we look at what does it mean for those of us who are white to take responsibility for doing the work of anti-racism, we really look at how racism and anti-racism functions. And we try to name that very specifically. So let's say in the middle of a workshop, something happens, then we'll name it for what it is, right? Real time for us happens right in workshops too. So for instance, earlier when you said that you had spoken with minorities, we would come in and talk about alternatives to that. So if we're talking about BIPOC people, then we would talk about persons of the global majority. Because in reality, when we're talking about a statistical minority, we're talking about how that functions within certain areas, specifically white dominant areas, right? Or all white areas. And that functions as a part of white segregation, which functions as a part of racism. So the way that we go about naming things for what they are and then guiding people toward alternatives reduces the amount of space, literal and figurative, for racism to exist, right? And a lot of times there's language around, especially within certain groups, the church, certainly, but other groups as well, right? We're concerned about the transformation of ideas or minds or values, or in the church, we might say, we're concerned about the transformation of hearts and minds. And we're both ordained people. So we do care about hearts and minds also. But the reality is, many times people are asking us to come in for 90 minutes of anti-racism training. And in 90 minutes, we're going to offer strategies. Like these are strategies that will actually dismantle racism. Now, what you do after the two ladies from For Reals leaves, that's totally different. That's something that each particular group has to take responsibility for, right? And one of the ways that we talk about how anti-racism can happen is challenging that, we need to transform hearts and minds so that everybody's thinking the same before we can move on. Because really all that does is protect and cushion those of us who are white over and over and over again, while BIPOC people are being harmed, even killed because of racism. Right? So even challenging something as that's sometimes seen as common sense or taken for granted, or of course that's true. We want to challenge people's minds. Of course we do. But if we wait until we have a full kind of consensus before we move forward with accountability and responsibility, then really what happens is that we're waiting for the most stubborn heart and mind to come around. All the while, the harm continues. So I think when our whole approach, not just this book, but the kind of framework that we're using is saying we can normalize the naming of racism for what it is, and the sharing of actual strategies that people can use right away. No matter what your entry point is, there is a place for for all of us to come in and do anti-racism work right now. You don't have to wait. You don't have to do a certain number of workshops. You jump in, you do some things, you get better, you keep going.
Wow. Powerful. So if you had one thing that you wanted people who read this book to take away from it, what would you each say that would be?
Coming to one, that's that's a little difficult. I would have to say entry points. We can all do anti-racism work right now. We don't have to wait until we are super qualified, or what we call super qualified. We don't have to take 50 anti-racism trainings. We don't have to take 10. We don't even have to take one. All you have to do is read this book and understand that we are giving you strategies. We are giving you strategies. We're providing you with scripts We are giving you exercises to practice so that when racism shows up, you can nip it in the bud, you can interrupt it, you can disrupt it, you can dislodge it, we can dismantle this work together right now. You don't have to wait until you have read every racism book out there. You just need to read this one, and you will gain all the strategies you need to combat racism.
This is hard because I was going to say what you said. So now I'm like, what's another reason? No, I think, so let me do it this way. So I'm going to speak kind of specifically for those of us who are white, right? None of us are not ready to do anti-racism work. Some of us choose not to do it. And I think that the way that our book is set up and the kind of format that we use and the way that we, again, create it in kind of like a workbook format, right? It's a usable, workable, practical way to start and continue anti-racism work. And I think that for those of us who are white, if we move away from the language and the idea that we're just not ready yet, and we start flipping that to, are we choosing to do anti-racism work or are we choosing not to do it? Once we make that flip, then we can start to engage in, what kind of risks are we taking and that kind of thing. And those are, again, also decisions that we have to make, but they're worth it. Anti-racism work is worth it. It's critical. It's necessary. It is the work that those of us who are white need to be doing, especially those of us who talk about wanting to be about justice or wanting to fight against oppression. And for those of us in the church, for those of us who want to be faithful disciples of Christ, who follow a God who is both of love and of justice and doesn't subsume either one to get to the other.
Very cool. So I know you're kind of in the midst of just launching this first book, so it's a little bit probably premature for me to ask this, but do you have any plans that you can talk about for follow-ons?
We absolutely do.
Oh, good.
So we do have on our list a children's book. And this is basically an introductory. This book is an introduction to the 4 Reels. And our hope is that we will give each chapter its own book. So each 4 Reel will have its own.
Cool. Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty exciting. That's a lot of runway out there. A lot of opportunity. Well, unfortunately.
Sorry.
I was saying, unfortunately, the issue's not likely to go away anytime soon. So, time-wise, there's probably plenty of room for multiple books.
Yes, that's unfortunate, but yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's unfortunate. Mm-hmm. Michelle, did you add something?
Oh, I was just going to say quickly, Chalice Press and For Reals have already been in conversations about creating a facilitator, either a pamphlet or booklet, plus some video aids for facilitators to be able to use the book in small group study or other venues too. So we've been in conversation with Chalice Press from the beginning, thinking of this For Reals as a For Reals series, and then with multiple teaching aids to help people be able to really use it and use it right away.
Excellent. Well, that's, just adds into the practical nature of what you put together. So that's exciting to hear. If people want to find out more about the book and some of those, other elements that are going to be coming out, I assume that they just go to the page on the Chalice Press website for the book? Or is there somewhere else that would work better?
Yes, Chalice Press. You can go on Chalice Press website for the information regarding the book.
Cool. All right. Well, this is exciting. And, again, I haven't heard of any other books that seem to be this practical, on the subject. So I'm really glad to see that, because there's just been a lot written about, more theory and, how the history behind racism and things like that,
Right.
but not as much as, what do we do about it, which I think is like the crux of the whole matter. So I'm really glad to see that you guys have tackled that, and not just in the form of the book too, but in the form of the training that you do. So it's wonderful to hear.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and best wishes with the rest of the book launch.
Thank you. We appreciate it. And we thank you for you taking this time to interview us.
Yes, absolutely.